friend, welcome to Betta Days. Today we're going to be covering a very fun and interesting topic, the best beginner plants for your Betta fish tank, or really any freshwater tank. A lot of these I started out with personally and I had a really good experience with them. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to be listing each plant and then we're going to be listing their requirements, how you need to plant them in your tank, and so forth. I also have an idea for a future video that I would love to make. I want to cover some specifics on how to plant a tank, basically aquascaping tips, if you will, because a lot of people seem to struggle with it. I'm not sure why. And then I realized one day I have acquired quite a few tips over the years that I would love to share. So if you would like a video on that, let me know in the comments. All right, let's go ahead and hop right into it. The first plant is probably everyone's favorite and one that you will always hear recommended, the Anubias. These plants are crazy hardy, they don't have very many requirements, and I would say that it was the first plant I ever started out with. I specifically remember walking into PetSmart and coming out with an Anubias, a pretty big one, in one of the cubes. They are really great plants, and there are a bunch of different kinds. Some grow smaller, some grow larger. There are so many different types. I won't list them all here, but thankfully all of the requirements are the same. Their lighting needs are low to moderate. They thrive in low light setups, which make them perfect for beginners. You can seriously place it in any dark corner of your Betta tank, although they do seem to do well with light, and they'll do well just fine. I recently saw a post on a Facebook page that somebody made, and they were talking about how they had ordered some of these plants in the mail. It had been lost for over a month, and when it finally showed up at their door, these plants were totally fine. Totally fine and healthy. For fertilizer, they will do fine with occasional adding of liquid fertilizer, and I use Easy Green by Aquarium Co-op, but you could probably use honestly any fertilizer. Easy Green just happens to be the only one I have used up to now, and I do love it. How to plant the Anubias. Do not bury the rhizome, the thick horizontal stem, with the roots in the substrate. Do not bury your Anubias. It does not want to be buried. It will rot if you do that. Instead, make sure that you attach it to driftwood rocks or any decoration. To do so, you can use aquarium safe glue. You can use a thread. I like to, if I want to attach it to, say, rocks or wood especially, I'll take a little bit of thread and just kind of wrap it around that wood and secure it so that it has some time to root or wrap around that wood or attach to the rock. And after that, I just cut and get rid of the thread. That is one of my favorite ways to anchor it. I will be going more in depth on how I anchor and plant things in the later video that I want to make that I mentioned earlier. These plants are great because they're hardy, they're slow growing, and Bettas love resting on the broad leaves. Now, like I said before, there are some miniature versions of this plant, but for the most part, the leaves are really broad and they do make great Betta resting spots. The next plant is a Java fern. These are really bushy, they can grow long, tall leaves, they can grow shorter, bushier leaves just like the Anubias. There is a pretty great variety of Java fern plants, but again, they all have the same requirements. For lighting, it's low to moderate. Avoid intense light because it can cause algae growth. For fertilizer, not a whole lot is required, really. You don't have to have any, but if you're dosing liquid fertilizer anyway, they will like that just the same. And just like the Anubias, just place it in the tank, anywhere in the tank. Don't bury the roots, don't bury the rhizome. You can wedge it in between rocks, you can wedge it in between wood. It's fine, that's all you have to do. Super duper easy. Amazon sword. I love Amazon swords. The first one I ever got is actually in the 5-gallon behind me. It is my favorite. I love the large broad leaves. It is a wonderful way to create a background, a natural background for your Betta tank, as they will just branch out and pretty much just cover the entire background. So they are a background plant. The lighting needs are moderate to high. It needs a decent light to thrive, so you're going to want to get a full spectrum aquarium light. You can get one on Amazon for relatively cheap, around $18 to $25, and they will do just fine. For fertilizer, root tabs are recommended or a planted substrate because you do need to plant these plants in the substrate. The roots do actually need to go into the substrate. They are root feeders. So plant the roots in the substrate, leave the crown where the leaves meet the roots above the surface, and it will thrive. In this tank, I have a planted substrate, so for the time being, I don't have to worry about adding root tabs. But if you just have regular gravel, get you some root tabs. I really like the Seachem root tabs. I'll put a picture of them here because I, for the life of me, can't remember what they're called, but I do love them. I used them in my old tank when I only had gravel, and they worked really well. Java moss. This plant is really, really flexible. You could put it anywhere. You can attach it to your wood and it will grow on the wood. It will create a carpet. You can place it on the bottom of your tank, it'll create a carpet. You could spread it over a rock and create a soft resting place for your betta. You could put this thing anywhere. I had it in my last tank in the 10-gallon. I attached it to the wood I had in there and it just grew. It just went crazy. For fertilizer, it's very minimal. It really doesn't require any, but it will do well with liquid fertilizer since you aren't actually planting it in the substrate. It doesn't need to be planted. Just throw it anywhere you want. You can leave it floating or attach it to rocks. You do not need to bury it in any way into the substrate. Cryptocoryne, another wonderful plant. A lot of people just call them crypts. I have one in my 5-gallon and it is loving the planted substrate, but again, if you just have gravel in your tank, you can get you some root tabs. For these, the lighting needs are low to moderate. They are very, very slow growing and hardy plants, so don't expect a whole lot of growth from these. Just like with the Anubias, they just don't grow very quickly, but they do stay really pretty. To plant, just stick the roots in the substrate, leave the crown with the leaves above the substrate, just like you would for the Amazon sword, and make sure you have some kind of fertilizer underneath the roots, whether it's root tab or you have a planted substrate. Water wisteria. This is probably the 3rd or 4th plant that I ever got. I had just a bunch of it gifted to me and it did really, really well. For this plant, the lighting needs are moderate to high. The fertilizer, it will benefit from either liquid fertilizer or root tabs. Why? Because it can either be left floating in the water or it can be buried because it does grow roots. So if you bury it, you're going to want a planted substrate or root tabs, or if you want to leave it floating, it will do just fine with liquid fertilizer. This plant is really great because it grows really quickly. The leaves are very unique and add a lot of interest to the tank, and it's really good for absorbing extra nutrients in the water, which helps to prevent a lot of algae growth. Hornwort. I loved this plant for a long time, but now I have mixed feelings because I got one that died and the needles of this plant went everywhere. Think of a pine tree. It's very similar in that if it dies or part of it dies, it will release those needles everywhere and they will be all over your tank. So if you're going for a more messy, natural kind of tank look, you're probably going to love it. But if you don't like that and you don't like cleaning up a bunch of needles, you may not want this plant. But I wanted to leave it in here because it is a great beginner plant. It is kind of hard to kill this thing, and I loved it for quite a while. It's great, adds a lot of places for your betta to hide, and overall it's okay. I just didn't like the needles, so I stopped keeping it in my tank. The lighting needs are moderate to high. It grows faster with more light. The fertilizer is minimal. It just absorbs the nutrients directly from the water. To plant it, you can either leave it floating or you can anchor it in directly into the substrate. If you do this, bury just a part of the stem into the substrate and make sure it's either planted or you have some root tabs in there. Duckweed. This plant, it's a floating plant, and it is great for beginners because it's very hard to kill it, but once you have it in your tank, unless you completely rip out the tank and redo everything, it's going to be in the tank forever. You cannot get it out, so do your research. If you really want it in your tank, great, you can get it. But for me, it became annoying after a while. I didn't like reaching in and doing water changes and having it all over my arms, all over my equipment. So you may not want this plant. If you happen to want it, then go for it. It's really easy. Anacharis. I love this plant. I had it in the tank that I got rid of, and it grew really, really well. It grew pretty quickly, and it's just a beautiful and unique looking plant. The lighting needs are moderate to high. It benefits from liquid fertilizer, and it can either be left in the substrate or floating. It's great because it's fast growing and it helps to absorb the excess nutrients, keeping the tank clean, much like the hornwort and the water wisteria. And last but not least, Buce or Bucephalandra. Similar to the Java fern and the Anubias, it does not want to have its roots buried, so make sure you anchor it to a rock or wedge it into some wood. It does best with liquid fertilizer and low to moderate lighting. And that's really all you need to know about that plant. It's really pretty. It is on the more expensive side and it's going to be harder to find in local pet stores. I guess maybe it's more of a rare plant, but it's still pretty affordable if you ask me. I really enjoy having them in my tanks. So if you want them, check out some online plant shops and you should be able to find some. But you can easily start with the Anubias or Java fern and you're going to have a similar experience. They just look a little bit different. Now, here are a couple beginner tips just to get you started. Number one, lighting. Most beginner plants will thrive in low to moderate lighting. Avoid overly intense lights as they can promote algae growth. And again, the best light to get for your plants are full spectrum lights. You can look them up on Amazon. There are so many available. And really you need these because normal regular LED, the lights that you get with the tank, if it comes with the tank, they're not going to cut it. They don't mimic the natural sunlight that your plants are going to need, so that's why you need full spectrum. Fertilizer. Use liquid fertilizers for the water column feeders and root taps for the root feeders. Start with minimal fertilization and adjust based on plant growth. You don't have to be super obsessive about how or when you fertilize. Read the instructions on the package and then just kind of go with that. With the root tabs, you bury it and they will usually last for a few months. And with the liquid fertilizers, you would either add it to your tank once you complete a water change, or if you go for a while without a water change, you would just establish if you do a weekly or bi-weekly refertilization. It's really quite flexible, so it's entirely up to you how you do this. Just make sure you don't add too much at one time, and I think you can kind of gauge how much too much would be, because you will get a lot of algae in your tank if you do that. With CO2, none of these plants need CO2. That's why they're really super easy and wonderful beginner plants. I have never had CO2 in my tanks. I like to keep my tanks low tech. That's kind of the lingo we use for tanks that don't have a lot of extra things added to it. It's pretty much just substrate, water, heater, filter, and plants. That's a low tech tank. So if you've never heard that term before, now you know. For tank maintenance, regularly trim your plants to prevent overgrowth and remove any decaying leaves or plant matter to maintain a good water quality. Your snails will eat any dead or dying plant matter, but depending on the plants you have, you may have an excessive amount in the beginning. When you first put the plants in your tank, just remember that plant melting can happen, and melting is where your plants are getting used to the parameters in your tank, because wherever they were before, the parameters were a little different. So the leaves that they had may melt and die, but don't worry, because new leaves will grow from the roots and the rhizome of those plants, and they will be healthy and perfectly fine. I have noticed that it is helpful if you buy the plants from your area. So where I live, if I buy plants from someone in my state or in my area, the water conditions are going to be very, very similar, especially if you're using tap water. So if you do that, then the likelihood of plant melting is much lower. Just keep that in mind. Now you know the best beginner plants for your Betta tank. I'm so glad that you have decided to start keeping plants in your Betta tank, whether you're switching from plastic or you're actually just beginning your journey and you've decided to start off strong. I'm so glad that you've decided to do this. Painted tanks are always the best for bettas because they mimic a natural habitat. It's more gentle on betta fins, so it's going to prevent rips, and overall it's just the best. It's beautiful. I can't say enough about live plants. If this is your first time here, go check out the other videos I have. This channel is full of helpful content and it grows each and every week as I release new videos every single Sunday. Also, if you have not yet, check out the description of this video. I have a bunch of fun links there. I have links to my Instagram, to my Pinterest, to my free Facebook group, the Betta Fish Forum, and to a free guide that I am currently offering. Let me know which plant or plants you're going to try in the comments, and I will see you soon.